And welcome back to the Barry Foster Show. Glad to have you with us. And I'll remind you that if you can find us on the Barry Foster Show at YouTube. If you have any thoughts, ideas, or suggestions, just drop us a line at the Barry Foster Show at gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. And remember, if you're listening to this, hit that red subscribe button. It'll help us a lot. On the phone, we are delighted to have the beautiful and lovely Kaylee Tuck, who's out on recess here briefly between this session and the special session. Kaylee, good to have you with us, my dear.
Barry, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, your first session, you had the big bill, which was HB1, which dealt with women in sports. This year, you've got another big bill, the farm bill, and I think most people only know that from banning fluoride in the water.
Yeah, and it's kind of a shame. I very much believe in that provision. When you really think about it, and I think COVID highlighted this quite a bit, where the government shouldn't be telling us what we need to take for our health. And fluoride has been in the water for decades now, and local governments add it to the water supply for quote unquote healthy reasons. But I think we saw during COVID, we realized that where's the line on that? So we wanted to make sure that water hydrates and doesn't medicate. So that was a big provision of the bill when it comes to what was talked about, but that bill had so many good things involved in it. We did a retail fuel switch transfer grant program. We saw during Hurricanes Helene and Milton this past year that you had a lot of the gas stations, particularly in our area, that they had gas, but they didn't have power. And they were built so long ago that they don't have the generators to power the gas station. So you had to keep on driving if you were trying to evacuate. So there's a grant program for smaller gas stations like that. We had some drone language in there. We've had a lot of ag operations that have people who fly drones. They come and harass the ag operations, poultry in particular, cattle, dairy, things like that. So we made it a new crime to harass ag production with drones. We have a new state crime for mail theft, which I didn't even know wasn't a state crime. I think it actually absolutely should have been before this, but we fixed that. So we did a lot of really good, really cool things in that bill for ag and consumers. And I kind of wish I would have been able to highlight it a little bit more, but the fluoride was where the conversation steered.
Yeah, well, I thought it was under Jeb Bush that they made it a rule that all the 7-Eleven stores, all the convenient marts had to have, or the gas stations had to have at least a plug for a generator, bring in a portable generator after a big hurricane or some other natural disaster. But did that go? Obviously, that must have gone away somewhere along the line.
So it didn't go away, but the gas stations that were built before that time were not required to. They were grandfathered in. So if you look at the grant program, you have to be built prior to that time period. And then if you're a fiscally constrained county, you get $10,000. If you're not a fiscally constrained county, you get $5,000 towards retrofitting your gas station to be able to handle those generators.
Oh, is that the way? Yeah, you would just think that the way that things work, it would be in your best interest to be able to provide fuel after one of these disasters to keep the cash register ringing.
Oh, I would think so too. And when we looked at which gas stations would be affected, they were all along evacuation routes. So I don't know why this wasn't picked up before, because they were all along 27, 17, 75. And when you looked at who would be affected, it was essentially everybody that was trying to evacuate from the coast, which is our biggest issue when it comes to hurricanes. So I'm surprised it hadn't been done before, but I was happy to get it done this year. That was Wilton Simpson's agency package, and he always has vision and a really good eye for what needs to be done. So I was happy to be able to carry that.
Well, there were some other ag disaster and relief provisions in there too that you guys passed.
Yeah, there was quite a bit. So, way back in the 90s, whenever canker was the big deal for citrus, canker and greening, there were some pretty archaic provisions that it wasn't archaic at the time, but essentially you couldn't have a nursery within a mile of of an orange grove and things like that. So we deleted a couple of those provisions. We have a scholarship program for FFA and 4-H. So if kids want to participate in that, and I'm trying to remember the statistic that Wilton gave at the press conference, but I think in the last 2 years with that scholarship program and continuing to fund it through the FDACS department, we've seen double enrollment in FFA and 4-H programs, which I think is phenomenal. Not every kid has to be in ag necessarily, but I remember when I was in FFA, we did parliamentary procedure, we did extemporaneous speaking, we did everything that's a life skill, not necessarily just raising an animal. So I think those programs are phenomenal.
I saw that there were protections for 4-H and FFA, and when I was reading it, I thought, does 4-H and FFA need protection? Here in Highlands County, we might be a little ag, we might be a little rural, but everything seemed to be going pretty smoothly as far as we could see.
Yeah, what's funny is, so I think the provision you're referencing is the preemption that we have for schools to be able to build an ag barn. And I never thought this would be the case, but the city of Perry they have a middle high school there, and the city of Perry is very small, and they told their middle high school that no, they could not build an ag barn for their 4-H and FFA program because it was against the city's zoning laws. And schools have their own building code essentially, so that shouldn't have been the case anyways, but we just wanted to make absolutely certain. We're pretty sure that was the law in the first place, but it wasn't worth the fight. We just said, hey, we're going to clarify this. But I never thought you'd be able to tell a school no to build something for a program.
One of the things I thought was very interesting is the provision that you now can return solar fields back to an ag. Was there a provision before that you couldn't do that?
Not necessarily. What we were finding, though, was, and this is no secret to us, we've seen several orange groves that have been turned into solar fields in the past, 5 years or so in our area. What you're finding is these solar fields only have a usable life of, 30, 45 years. So what we're seeing now is a lot of solar fields being turned over and taken up, and their usable life is done, so they're being sold, but they're not being put back into ag production. They were ag in the first place, but they weren't being turned back into ag. So what we said with this provision is, as of 2009, if the property was in ag production for the prior 5 years, so going back to 2004, then ag gets a right of first refusal. We're not saying that it's the best ag production. We're not saying it's good, but FDACS in conjunction with DEP can be able to evaluate the land and say, yes, this would be good for ag production, good for conservation, and we can buy it before they can sell it to a commercial, to build a shopping mall or whatever else.
And for our friends who don't speak ag out there, FDACS is the Florida Division of Agricultural Sciences. So that's what FDACS is, and they do well. They really present a lot of legislation when it comes to agriculture and agricultural products.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I didn't realize how much reach they actually have. They also, like we talked about, the transfer switches. They regulate gas stations. They are concealed weapons permit folks, which we did some concealed weapons stuff this year, which I was really proud of. And they do a lot of things that are kind of ag adjacent, but not direct. So it was they have a lot of plates in the air.
Yeah, let me ask you about this. We talked a little bit about fluoride in the water, stuff that people didn't know about, but you've done some things with food labeling, and I'm really glad to see this because when you go pick up produce and you see a product of, I want to know where of is and what does that mean about some of the stuff we're taking home.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've done their best to do the Fresh from Florida label and the truth in labeling from where it actually comes from. This year, what we did was targeted fake animal products. So milk, meat, poultry, and some of those products. And what a lot of people don't realize is that I think it's been since, the mid 1970s, the FDA at the federal level has had very specific identity standards for what you can consider milk and what you consider meat and things like that. But from administration to administration, they've issued rules that essentially don't match what the actual federal statute says. So what we're saying is if 11 of the 14 southeastern states adopt a very similar law, then we're going to enforce what the federal identity standards are for these products. So, soy milk is not milk. And, we're not saying don't drink it, but what we're saying is it's not a perfect substitute nutrition-wise for actual milk. So that's what we did there. And that one caused a little bit of controversy as well, but it's from the folks who are, not happy with
When you say
animal products in
controversy,
general.
does that mean the lobbyists didn't like it? Is that what we are defining as controversy sometimes?
It kind of depends. For example, this bill had 4 committee stops. In the second committee stop, we had a gentleman, and he was representing himself, but he does represent a different group, and he was there for a different reason. But he got up there and was upset because he was vegan, and he thinks this is targeting vegans, and it's not. It's totally not. But we've noticed a lot of folks get upset because they just don't like animal-based products in general. And they think that we're targeting plant-based products, and we're not targeting anybody. We just want to make sure the consumer knows what they're buying.
Yeah, it's very interesting because we were up, and I've told this story a couple of times. We were up in Winter Haven, and there was a gal that had peaches for sale. And I said, "Are you organic?" And she says, "We just don't put any pesticides, herbicides, or fungicides on our products." I said, "Okay, so why aren't you organic?" And she says, "Well, it costs too much to be organic. That there actually were more laws on people who wanted to say they didn't put stuff on their produce than people who did put stuff on their produce."
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think and for those who don't know, my grandfather is a caladium producer, and he pays attention to a lot of the labeling standards for plant products. And one of his biggest complaints, I remember when we were little, he would always say this: whenever somebody says they are green, quote unquote green, there are no standards for what green is. So, if you're a pesticide company and you want to put that you're a green product, that doesn't mean anything. So we just want to make sure that labels mean something.
Yeah, I got two really questions kind of off, but you said you did some stuff about concealed carry. What did the legislature do about concealed carry in the last session?
So we didn't do, when it comes to concealed carry, I don't want to mislead anybody. FDAX is also the administrator of concealed weapons licenses, and you've seen a dip in issuance of concealed weapons licenses, mostly because we don't need them anymore. In Florida, we're constitutional carry, and you don't need a license to carry, but a lot of people go out of state and they want to be able to carry out of state, and other states require it, and this and that. So there were some provisions in the concealed weapons statute that talk about whenever you have what's called a disqualifying event. So a disqualifying event is maybe you were arrested for an alleged felony, domestic battery, things like that, which would disqualify you from getting a concealed weapons license. The time period for the agency to review that disqualifying event was essentially non-existent. So if, like, let's say you go to court and the court says, "Oh no, you didn't do this, you're innocent," the department didn't have to do anything about it. So what we did is put time periods on it and say, okay, if you go to court and you don't have a disqualifying event, it turns out you don't, then they have 45 days to be able to issue you your permit. And essentially put time periods on the department to actually do that. That was more of a Nikki Fried loophole to not issue permits. Wilton Simpson has actually, disseminated a 35,000 person wait list, which was pretty cool. So
That is, and you also did some things about ESG. Was that kind of a preventative measure, kind of a preventative strike about environmental, social, and governance language in was legislation or in other kind of rules?
yeah, and the way I looked at it from a legal perspective is a loophole that was being closed. So we did the ESG, I think it was 2023 session, maybe. But when you look at the statute that was created, it says person, individual, things like that. And normally in legal jargon, that also means companies. But when it comes to ag production, there was some argument over whether it was the individual farmer or a company. Like, Dairy Producer LLC may not be able to sue because of an ESG practice. So we wanted to make sure that if there is any discrimination in lending based on an ESG practice for a farming company, that was also a cause of action.
Another big thing was having to do with housing. I know this was a pet project of Ben Albritton, president of the Florida Senate up there. What does this mean? Can you now use ag land for ag housing? Is that kind of the way it works?
Sort of, and that was actually a bill that I've run for the past 2 years, and the governor vetoed it last year with some concerns, immigration concerns. So we put some substantial penalties in there this year if you're housing illegal workers, and it was able to get it across the finish line. But essentially, if you have a bona fide ag operation, which means you can't just have ag zoned property, there's tons of ag zoned property. You have to have a commercial ag operation that the property appraiser recognizes as a commercial ag operation. And if you have 20 acres or more, then you can build a certain amount of housing for your workers. It has to be H-2A. It has to be, they have to be federally verified. It has to be E-Verify compliant. And essentially you can build housing. And the great part about that is, we have a housing crisis for people who actually live here. It's even tougher for the folks like citrus and berries and watermelons and tomatoes and the seasonal that they're, when you can't afford to buy a hotel like some folks can in the inner areas down south, then you are relegated to a single family home in a neighborhood and things like that. And that's just not ideal. So this is another option.
We're talking with Kaylee Tuck, Florida House Representative, and Kaylee, the big, I guess the 800-pound gorilla in the room right now is you're on recess and you're fixing to go back, and there's going to be, I guess, some kind of a war between the ideas of whether we should have property tax reduction or sales tax reduction. What's your call on that? What do you think about this?
Yeah, and I'm glad you called it a war between the taxes. I think one of the most frustrating things for me and for us as members is this is in the media has kind of been relegated to, well, individual House members hate the governor and the governor hates individual House members. And that's just not the case. Governor DeSantis is the best governor we've had in a very long time. And I don't think anybody disagrees about that. What I think is pretty cool is that we live in a state where we can argue about which taxes to cut. And I'm really happy to be in that position. What I think the issue is, and a lot of people don't realize how the state budget works, but the state budget is essentially on a rolling average, a 5-year average. So we have some very, very smart economists that work for the state, and they look at the prior 5 years revenue and spending, and then they use that to project the next 5 years revenue and spending. And what they told us is if you keep spending the way you do on member projects, on agency budgets, on things like that, then you are going to be in a deficit by the 2026-2027 fiscal year. And that's a really scary feeling for somebody like me who will be in leadership at that time and have a lot of say in how the budget works. So what we in the House are saying is we need to decrease spending. We can't pay for every road. We can't pay for every fire truck. We just can't do it. So there's a slight disagreement about that. And the Speaker of the House, his mentality is you have to take away the incentive to spend. So that's the impetus for the 0.75% sales tax cut is taking away the ability to spend that much money. The property taxes come in, and to be clear, we are doing something about property taxes. The misconception is that we can do something now. Local governments absolutely can and should do something now, but property taxes, the ability to assess a property tax is constitutional. So we at the legislature can put a ballot measure on the ballot, but you won't see it until the 26th ballot, and then you won't see relief until the end of 2027. So that's what we're stuck with, is trying to provide relief now in a way that we can, versus trying to provide relief later on in a very meaningful way. And I think we can do both.
Well, let me sanctify you as a Republican here just for a second, because the chairman of the Republican Party of Florida, Evan Power, has started this rollback hashtag rollback now movement, trying to get the members of each county to go before their respective county commissions and ask that they stick with what is called the rollback rate. For the folks who don't know, that is the rollback rate is the amount of taxes it would take to generate the same number of tax dollars as the previous year, and so that would it would not be necessarily a tax cut, but it certainly would stop any kind of tax increase. Have you heard or seen anything from your side of the aisle, the Republicans, getting motivated behind that rollback now that might help uh, the legislature with a grassroots tax reduction movement that would kind of help you and when you get into this special session?
I certainly hope so. I mean, you and I both know my grandmother. She has been preaching the rollback rate for a very long time now. She's actually who I learned what the rollback rate is from. I had no idea what it even was. Granted, she was preaching it to me, when she first got elected in 2018. I didn't really care because I was in law school and had exams to study for and all that fun stuff. So I think there is a grassroots effort, and I think there should be a grassroots effort. The problem that I have, and that I struggle with is one, I think we need to have a very thoughtful approach to what we bind a local government's hands with in terms of their taxing authority. It's really easy to say we need property tax relief until you need to call 911 and there's no police or fire to come save you. And then when it comes to the state revenues and the conversation right this minute, and the overriding conversation for session is that we can use sales tax revenues to supplement local government budgets that are cut by property taxes, and that's all fine. But do we as Highlands County, and do we as my district, or do we as Miami, or do we as whoever want the state government to be in charge of how much money they think our county needs? And so I think there's a lot of moving parts here, and there needs to be a more thoughtful approach. That being said, local government's budgets are bloated, and I'm not going to say that in our counties we have a significant problem. I think we've seen it a lot in the coastal counties in particular, where you've seen the multi-million-dollar mansions being taxed into oblivion. But when it comes to our counties, I think we need to look at having more of a tax base. I know there's been a lot of anti-development rhetoric in some of my outlying counties and things like that. And, that development helps. And when we have, I think the conversation in property taxes is going to evolve into how do we give homesteaded property relief. I think this needs to be a thoughtful approach. I think local governments need to really assess their budget. One of my biggest complaints is whenever a local government uses increased tax revenue for salary increases. Now, we want to be able to keep good people, but does one administrator need 7 support staff? And that's the kind of thing that really irks me. Now, I have no problem with, filing an appropriation project at the state level to help my county, build a road or have a wastewater conversion project or something like that. And if increased tax revenue goes to saving for those projects, I'm all in. But when it's just getting spent for no reason, and now we have, several administrators with 6-figure salaries, that's where I have a problem.
So let me ask you: you've gotten by your baby legislature terms. You're kind of moving up. Is it getting any easier to kind of move through the legislature and make things happen, to get provisions in that you want or out that you don't want?
I think it just gets harder. What I will say is that this year has been particularly tough because you've seen fights that are all at the upper level. Me as a fifth year legislator, I'm not going to be in the room whenever it's a conversation with the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House, and the governor. So in this scenario in particular, it's really hard to get the provisions in that you want. I think if it was a different environment, then yes, it would be easier for us to be able to work to get the provisions that we want. Now I will say, talk to me after next March, whenever our class takes over, and we're going to be doing some really, really good things so that I can say I had a personal hand in helping with, which is going to be pretty cool when that time comes. As of right now, it's a lot of upper level conversations happening.
Well, Kaylee, after all the stuff gets done in the ether and you get done with the special session and everything's come to a halt, I'd like to talk to you again and you can kind of give us more of an overview of how this tax fight played out and what happened after all the shouting's over.
Oh, I would love to. What's funny is we all have the same goal, and we can argue about how to get there, but it's all the same goal. So I'm anxious to see how it's going to pan out, and we as a body have promised to put property tax relief on the ballot, which I'm sure is going to pass with overwhelming support. And we've also made promises to cut taxes, whether it's sales tax or business rent tax or whatever it may be. It's all going to happen. So I'm anxious to see how it all happens.
Kaylee, we really appreciate your time so much. And like I say, when this is all over at the end of June, I want to talk to you again because this is fascinating, fascinating stuff.
Oh yeah, it's fun to know the inside baseball of it all, and what's been interesting about this TIF in particular is that it's kind of all out in the open, and people have their own opinions. But it's interesting to watch it all. It's definitely been a learning experience for me.
Right, a fight in a fishbowl. You know what I mean?
Yes, yes, yes.
Kaylee, thank you so much. You've been listening to the Barry Foster Show. I'll remind you again, any thoughts, ideas, suggestions, questions, whatever, you can get in touch with us at the Barry Foster Show at gmail.com. That's the Barry Foster Show at gmail.com. We appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next time.